Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, high school teacher in Los Angeles. And I am trying to build my podcast and my social media and everything like that to expand my classroom. So one of the things that I tell my students all the time is, do you have something better to do than make the world a better place? So that's kind of my aim. And I'm thrilled to have my guest today as someone who's really influenced my teaching a lot. And one of the cool things about having a podcast is you can have these conversations with amazing people. So my guest today is Dr. Nicholas Christakis. Just to run down his bio. I mean, I could probably talk for 20 minutes on his bio, but a sociologist and a medical doctor. He's a director of the Human Nature Lab at Yale. He's an author, he's a professor, and two most recent books are Blueprint and Apollo's Arrow. And I'm going to touch on both of those because I think that we can blend those ideas together. I just want to say, Professor Christakis, thank you so much for being here. I'm really thrilled to pick your brain about a few things.
Call me Nicholas, William, and I'm really happy to be here.
Okay, I will. So one of the things that stands out to me about you is you mix the hard sciences and the soft sciences. And I think that that's really important if we're going to try and get to the best ideas, because you're a sociologist and a medical doctor. So can you tell the audience a little bit about the Human Nature Lab? Because it seems like a pretty incredible thing.
I could, but I'm sort of very tempted to go immediately in a kind of philosophical direction. I don't know who your listeners are and what their interests might be, but you know, the philosophical direction, and I can come back to what my lab does, sure, if you know, but the philosophical direction is there are different ways of knowing the world. You know, we move through the world and we have a kind of personal experience, of course, but there are also different formal ways. You know, so for example, some people think religion is the way to come to understand the world. And other people, for example, think that science is the way to understand the world. This also is called positivism. You know, this notion that there's an objective reality and that we can use science and the scientific method to approximate, to come to understand it. We're never perfect because we're humans, right, and we're imperfect. But, you know, we can use these methods, these scientific methods to see the world for what it is. And also, incidentally, use science and technology to improve the world. Like, as you said at the beginning to your students, you know, do you have anything better to do than making the world a better place? A good line. But the reason I mention this is that there's a tremendous variety of scientific disciplines, and they all have value, and they can range from sociology and anthropology to, you know, physics and economics and computer science and biology, and just so many different ways to try to use science to understand the world. And for me, I see no reason to respect those boundaries. You know, there's like the objective here is wisdom. The objective here is knowledge of the world. You know, disciplinary boundaries are not important in my view. And so, you know, when you highlight the variety of the breadth of training that I've had, or the variety of things we do in the lab, for me, those flow from a commitment to the primary commitment, which is to understand the world, and the method we use is of secondary importance. I'll say one other thing, and then I'll come back to the Human Nature Lab. If you've had the opportunity as a scientist to discover something, it's such an incredible feeling that once you've had that feeling, you want more. It is addictive. It's just like such a thrilling, you know, you have discovered something about the natural world. And that incredible feeling of excitement. I mean, this is impossible to describe. I've only had that feeling, you know, 4 or 5 times in my life where I've seen something I believe that no one had ever seen before. Little small things in my case, you know. Imagine if you're Galileo, right? Just imagine, you know, what it's like to be Galileo or Newton or Darwin, you know. So just, you know, the thrill, you know, that feeling. Anyway, so it's a very exciting to be a scientist, and I don't think one needs to be limited by disciplines. Now, in my lab, and then I'll shut up. It's a very long-winded answer to your
please. That's why I'm here.
And then in my lab, we do a bunch of things that span the natural and the social sciences. We have a division in the lab that looks at the evolutionary biology and genetics of human social interactions. For example, why do we have friends at all? Many people listening to this podcast will be like, oh, of course we have friends. But ask yourself, why does our species have friends? Other animals don't do this. Many animals have sex with each other, of course, reproduce sexually. Yeah. We mate with each other, so do they, but we also befriend each other. It's really odd. We do it. Certain other primates do it. Elephants do it. Certain whale species do it. That's pretty much it in terms of friendship. And we evolved the capacity for friendship and of social networks, the kind of pattern of friendships that we have, in a way that's very similar to elephants. And the elephants evolved it independently of us. Our last common ancestor with elephants was 90 million years ago. So they independently arrive on this behavior of being friendly. It's very odd. So we try to understand, in that part of my lab, we try to understand the biology and genetics of friendship. You know, why do we have friends? How do we pick our friends? Why do we feel good in the company of our friends? Many listeners will take it for granted. You'll be like, well, of course you feel good in the company of your friends, but why? Why did we evolve this warm feeling when you're near your friends? And so on. That's the first branch of the lab. Or how do we have like at first sight? We've all had that experience of you meet someone and you instantly like them. Some people have had love at first sight. And you can make an argument as to, from evolutionary biology, as to why we have love at first sight, why it would make sense to be able to pick out a suitable mate, you know, why that would make Darwinian sense. But we also have like at first sight, which is much more common in our species. Many people have had like at first sight. Why? Why do we have this ability? Anyway, that's the first branch of the lab. The second branch of the lab is we do projects in the developing world where we try to apply mathematical models of influence within face-to-face social networks, trying to identify who's an important person in this village, so that if we get them to change their behavior, everyone in the village will copy them. Not based on who they are, but based on where they are in the human social network. And we develop some mathematics of that, and then we do field tests in India and Honduras and Uganda and different parts of the world, where we'll go into this group of villages and we'll say, how can we change everyone's behavior here to be better with respect to vaccination or latrine usage or breastfeeding or other public health things? So that's the second branch of the lab. The third branch of the lab does work on online experiments. We have some software that, if you're interested, you can go to breadboard.yale.edu. And this is software we've released publicly, and we use this software to create temporary artificial societies of real people. So tens of thousands of people come into our laboratory for half an hour, participate in an experiment, and we, in this kind of godlike way, manipulate the social order, or we create unequal and equal, so we give them money, real money to play with, and then we make some societies unequal and some societies equal, and then we see, well, what is the implication of inequality, economic inequality, which we artificially create, to see how it affects people's behavior. So that's the third branch of the lab, these online experiments. Then we have a little social robotics division, where we try to evaluate how online bots and humanoid physical robots change human behavior. And then last, we have a group that does statistical analyses of big data sets. We do sort of computational social science. So it's a huge range of stuff in the lab, and it's just very exciting for me, and I feel very fortunate that I'm able to work with such talented young people.
I mean, that's a lot. Is this unique? I've never really heard of anything other than this going on in American academia. Is this fairly common, or is this pretty unique, what you're doing?
I don't know. It's what I do. I mean, you're right. I haven't.
Awesome.
I don't know how common this is, but it's what I do. I mean, there are many scientists who run big labs that have many different things that they do. For example, I know one physicist at Harvard, Eric Mazur, who has multiple divisions in his lab. They do photonics. They do stuff on light. They have a sort of sort of biomedical engineering component where they try to use the discoveries from the physics of light to do biological experiments. And then they also have projects they do on physics education. So Eric's lab is pretty broad. And then I know other scientists like Doug Melton, who's also at Harvard, who is a stem cell biologist, and he has a huge range of stuff that he does too.
Okay.
So I don't know. I mean, yes, I agree with you, it's broad, but how unique it is, I don't know.
Yeah. So the asking the why over and over and over again about things that we just take for granted is so cool. I had Franz de Waal on my podcast a couple of weeks ago.
It's amazing. He's one
awesome.
of one of my favorite scientists. Yeah, he's brilliant.
Yeah, and just like the way that you can study apes and chimps to understand people. You mentioned elephants a little bit, and asking the questions why. Like when I was a kid, I remember hearing that dolphins had sex for pleasure. And I was like,
Yes.
Oh, they're like one of the rare animals that did. But then when you dig into why, it's actually because the males eat the babies if they're not theirs. So it's actually a little bit more dark. Like the females just have as much sex as possible. So it confuses the males and they say, all right, I'm not going to eat this baby because it might be mine. It's like, oh, well, it's not as simple as they're just like, free flowing hippies out in the water. When you talk about the religion and science kind of blending, would you say that religion could be like a hypothesis creator? That you use that kind of thing because maybe science isn't going to be on its own. The hard sciences would be like a way to find out what to use science for.
No,
So maybe
I wouldn't.
you use. No,
I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, this, of course, an old topic that you're bringing up, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of literature and thinking about this topic. No, I would just say that different people have different attitudes about the path to truth, and incidentally, I don't think they're incommensurate. I mean, I think there's some very religious people who are terrific scientists. Einstein was quite religious, for example, in a certain way. And so, I think that they're just alternative ways. It's like alternative philosophies about how we discover the truth of the world. And but I would not say that religion is hypothesis generating, like that it is providing ideas for scientists to explore, for example. I wouldn't agree with that. If you're asking whether there are rightly moral constraints on science, that's again a very difficult question. I mean, I would probably say yes and no. In general, I would not want any constraints on science. I would want scientists, and there are no intrinsic constraints. I mean, the only constraints on science should be the constraints of the real world. One of the things I tell my graduate students about why it's so good to be a scientist is that that reality is a cruel mistress. In other words, you do experiments and you find what you find. You get what you get and you don't get upset. It's like that's the reality. It's like you might wish for things to be in some different way, but tough luck. This is the way they are, and you are constantly bumping up against what is real. You can't define it away. You can't fantasize that the world would be different than it is, or whatever. I mean, you can, but it's not scientific.
Right.
And so, and in a way, that's almost pleasing, right? That's a constraint. Reality is a constraint on science, and that's clearly a legitimate constraint. Now, whether morals or ethics are a legitimate constraint, I don't know. I mean, there are many examples of science being used to harm. So I'm absolutely not suggesting that science is devoid of ethical considerations. I'm just saying it's not easy to imagine how we would design an ethical system to constrain what is explored or what is discovered.
Yeah, because that's what science is. Essentially, it's just. I mean, it's there. It's just like it's uncovering it. You're discover. It's a great word. Is that you discover science? You don't create it. You discover what is.
Yeah.
There's a line in the Jurassic Park, the original Jurassic Park movie. I have little kids, so we watch Jurassic Park. And there's a line where he says, the guy who runs the park is saying, our scientists have done things that no scientists have ever done. He said, yeah, they were so preoccupied with whether or not they didn't stop to think if they should.
Right.
And that there is something to that, right? I mean, the discovery of the hydrogen bomb and stuff like that, could be great, but it could be terrible. Like this is tough. And I don't know how you guide that. That's why I brought up the idea of religion as like one of the ways. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
But I think, so I agree that we scientists should think about whether they should do something, but that decision has no bearing on whether hydrogen atoms fuse,
right?
Right. And it has no bearing on the physics of how hydrogen atoms fuse. Let's take human cloning, for example, where there was that experiment that was done in China a couple of years ago by that Chinese scientist who cloned the first genetically modified human embryos using CRISPR.
Yeah.
That is going to happen. I mean, that in the future, that is inevitable.
Already, yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, you can't stop it, right? I mean, there's something about, and there's a kind of inexorability to science that is unstoppable. I mean, I think the only constraint is when we discover everything there is to know about the universe, then we will stop. Short of that, we're just going to keep going. And so, once again, what I'm saying is that it's absolutely appropriate and right to have questions about the ethical regulation of scientific inquiry. But what I'm saying is it's not so obvious what that system would be and how to devise a system where the benefits outweigh the harms.
Well, especially if it's addicting, like you say,
so
you might be so addicted to the discovery that you are a little bit blinded to what would happen down the road if.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples was when I was a undergraduate at Yale in the 1980s. There was a class in bioethics that was offered in the biology department. And I was interested in ethics, but also I was looking for a broader class to take. I was taking all this molecular biophysics and biochemistry and physiology and reproductive biology and all this stuff. And I was like, well, why don't I take this ethics class in the biology department, which weirdly was taught by a botanist, by a man who studied plants. His name was Arthur Galston. And it was very odd, like, why is this botanist teaching a class in bioethics, about abortion rights and genetic modification, and I don't even remember all the topics. And at the end of the semester, he told us his life story. I'm going to butcher the story a little bit, but the gist of the story is as follows. He had been studying a kind of plant hormone called auxins, which the tree uses to communicate where it should form branches, like little buds that are going to come out of the trunk. How does the tree know, make a branch here, not somewhere else? So the trees apparently have this complicated biology. Maybe some of your listeners will know about this and write to correct me, but this is approximately what I remember learning from 30 or 40 years ago, so give me a break. Yeah. And this guy, Galston, had been studying plant hormones. And one day, he got visited by a couple of men in uniform from the military, some branch of the military, who were really interested in his work with plant hormones. And he was sort of flattered that anyone would be interested in this obscure scientific topic. And he briefed them or something. I'm not exactly sure what the nature of his interaction was. And then many years later, he learned that his research was crucial to the development of Agent Orange.
I was thinking that's where you're going with this. Okay.
Yeah. So during the war in Vietnam, the enemy to the Americans, the Vietnamese, the Northern Vietnamese, were hiding in forests, and the army wanted to basically defoliate the forest. They wanted to destroy the forest so that the humans couldn't hide there. It's awful, right? But that's what we wanted to do. So we would dump these chemicals on these big swaths of jungle, and the hormone research was used to create basically antidotes to the hormone, or to stop the work of the hormone that causes the branching, so that the trees would have no branches. Basically, I'm probably butchering this some, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah.
And so Professor Galston was devastated by this unintended, unanticipated application of his work on plant hormones to this destructive weapon that was used by our military on the other side of the planet. And this prompted him to begin to think about ethics, the ethics in science, which is why he was teaching a course in bioethics at Yale, 20 years later, this botanist. The contours of the story are approximately correct.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like Alfred Nobel, right? With the dynamite creating
Yes.
Nobel Prizes. It's like, oh, okay, well, you can always, if you do that, you can always steer the ship a different way. I do want to get into COVID a bit because I think that you, as a sociologist and who wrote and studied COVID, I just have a few questions about this, because now we're maybe we're not, but it feels like we're on the tail end. I mean, I'm double vaccinated, vaccinations are out there. I'm back in school now. Like, I'm here, and then I'm about to head off to go into my classroom and see my kids, still wearing masks and stuff. But I guess when this showed up, I was concerned about, the culture wars and stuff. And I was thinking, okay, well, this thing showed up. We have a common enemy, because that's typically, it seems like, as a history teacher, like in the past, when we've had, contentious times with each other, when we were shoulder to shoulder with a common enemy, we banded together. And I was thinking, this is it. And then like a week later, boom, 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 it just all unravels, and it becomes this whole thing. And there's people who are, COVID is a complete hoax. And then there's people that, are still, wrapping themselves in plastic and things. I don't know if you heard what happened in Brookline, Massachusetts. They just instituted still a mask mandate, even though you're outside and vaccinated and things like that, which is probably airing better, but it still is this, we're still so divided. And it became this thing that if you wear a mask, like, I have a weird medical history. So I stayed away, I stayed home, and we're really isolated. My family was really isolated. And everyone just assumed, because I was staying isolated, that I had like a stock of MAGA hats in my house. And it was like, well, like, why did we devolve so quickly? So I'm curious, as a sociologist, were you watching this unfold, and like, what did you see? Did this make sense to you, knowing how humans are, or did it happen in a way that you didn't foresee?
Well, first of all, your first point, I think, is wholly correct. That this is a trope in science fiction movies. That when the aliens invade the Earth, all human beings unite. And there's a famous saying that apparently Ronald Reagan asked Gorbachev. I don't know if you know the story. Like, Reagan turns to Gorbachev and he says, if we were invaded by aliens, would you help us? And Gorbachev said, of course. So this is an old trope. And I think actually that paradoxically the fall of the Soviet Union contributed to divisions in our society. I think it's not a coincidence that as a nation we seem so much more divided now than we were 20 years ago. Partly reflects the loss of it, as you suggest, of a common enemy in the United States. So we're falling upon each other because we don't have a shared adversary. Now, the idea that the germ, that SARS-CoV-2, would serve as such an adversary is also an old idea. And in fact, for thousands of years, people have speculated that when a plague hits, it will elicit in human beings a kind of cooperative sentiment. It's us against it. All of us, we need to band together to fight it. Mm-hmm. And so your query is not, you're not the first one to ask this question. But whether that happens varies. And it varies on a host of factors. It varies in part on how deadly the germ is. So I think there may be a sweet spot in terms of deadliness. If the germ is just killing everybody, then it may contribute to a kind of dog eat dog, war of all against all kind of situation. Sort of every man and woman for themselves.
Walking Dead style. Yeah.
Yes, kind of zombie kind of apocalypse situation. When if 80% of the city is dying and bodies are piling up on the streets, you're going to have a breakdown in social order. And this was seen, of course, during the bubonic plague in Europe, or in certain, for example, when the Native Americans were decimated by the smallpox and measles epidemics. We have historical accounts of epidemics in which basically the society was annihilated. Within 70 years, everyone died. And the initial sweep, just 50% of the people just died within a few months. Like Ebola, like nowadays, Ebola outbreaks can be similarly devastating. So, and on the other hand, if the pandemic is sort of like the one we have, which kills about 1% of the people that the germ infects, maybe that's not quite enough to galvanize our interest. So maybe there's a sweet spot. I'm speculating, I don't know, between mildly deadly and utterly devastating, where the threat might be sufficiently serious that we feel we must band together but not so serious as it degrades our capacity to do so. And so I think with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, we have not seen enough of a unified front, at least in our country, to cope with this. So, but the point you're asking is an old one, and people have asked that question before. And I would also say that there are absolutely ways in which plagues elicit both bad and good behavior in human beings. And we have examples of that now. For example, in our society, ironically, we had to band together to live apart, right? We had to kind of organize ourselves in order to protect ourselves, not just individually, but to protect each other. You can even think of the scientific collaboration, which gave rise to the mRNA vaccine, as a kind of wonderful quality of our species. And in Blueprint, as you alluded to, in Blueprint, earlier we talked about how we have this capacity for friendship, which is weird. We also have a capacity for teaching, which many listeners take for granted, that we teach each other stuff. But why? Why do we do that? Many animals can learn independently. A little fish, swimming in the ocean can learn that if it swims up to the light, it will find food there. Most animals learn, can learn by, classic conditioning. They learn about their environment on their own, independently, no other animals. But some animals also learn socially. In other words, you put your hand in the fire and you learn that it burns. You've acquired some knowledge, fire burns, but you paid a price, you burnt your hand. Or I can watch you put your hand in the fire and I gain almost as much knowledge, but I pay none of the price. That's called social learning, and that's incredibly efficient. Or for example, you and I go into the forest and you eat red berries and you die, and I see you die after you eat red berries. I'm like, whoa, I learned not to eat red berries. I pay none of the price. That's incredibly efficient, right? To be able to do that. So we can learn socially, and other animals can learn socially too. This is called social learning. Not many, but not as many as learn independently. But we do something that's even more amazing. We teach each other things. In other words, I don't just passively observe you burning your hand and then learn not to burn my hand, like from a distance. You teach me to light a fire. This is exceedingly rare in the animal kingdom, teaching, affirmative teaching. It's a kind of altruism. And it is universal in us, in humans, in our species. And this capacity for teaching actually lies at the core of our capacity for culture. The reason we are a cultural animal, by which I mean we can accumulate knowledge across time and space, right? Like we are the beneficiaries, like your students are born at a time when Newton has already invented calculus. And so they get to learn calculus if they wish. It's just given to them for free. Mm-hmm. If you took your students who know calculus and took them back 500 years, they'd be the smartest mathematician on the planet. So they're benefiting from our capacity to transmit knowledge across time because we're a teaching animal, and across space, right? So knowledge spreads over the surface of the planet. People teach each other. And that's what we use to fight the virus with the invention of a vaccine. We relied on decades of scientific progress, and we shared information widely. Scientists and doctors and engineers around the world were working on these vaccines. Mm-hmm. And this was the weapon that we used to fight back the virus. We had this ancient predilection to teaching, and it was this predilection that we were able to use to fight the virus, basically.
Yeah, that's obviously aligned with what I've dedicated my life to as a high school teacher. Watching this, it's only been a little over a year, really, where it's hit America, and how far we've come that now the conversation is like, COVID's not that bad. And I have to keep saying because it doesn't, whatever, outside or, on surfaces or whatever. But what if we didn't take it seriously? I hear over and over again that our response has been so overblown. And I think I'm in Los Angeles, so I get there's elements of that in politics and things like that. But what if we had kept dance clubs open and bars and stadiums?
Yeah, but overblown.
How bad would it have been?
Awful. Worse.
Really bad, right?
Well, there are limits to how bad it could have been. If you do the calculations, if you look at the fraction of, given the R naught, the basic reproduction number of the virus, which is about 3, it's the herd immunity threshold. If you do the basic calculation for this, the formula for that is R naught minus 1 divided by R naught. So about 67% of the people for the original variant of the virus would have to be infected before we reached herd immunity naturally. Actually, you have to revise that number downward to about 50%, given certain considerations about social network structure and how humans interact. Basically, some people have many connections and some people have few connections. And because of that, this simplified calculation I just mentioned has to be adjusted. Anyway, let's say about 50% of the people would have to be infected before the epidemic stopped. Now, the virus would still be circulating among us, still be killing people, but the epidemic would finally stop, having swept through the population naturally and infected 50% of Americans. So that's an intrinsic property of the virus. If we had not changed our behavior, it would have infected 50% of Americans at least. Mm-hmm. And another intrinsic property of the virus is it kills about 1% of the people that it gives symptoms to. This is another, I'm simplifying the story, but let's just say it's actually 0.5 to 0.8% of those infected will die. It varies a lot by age as well. And about twice that many, 1 to 1.6%, who are infected and get symptoms will die. But let's just say 1% for the calculation purposes. So 50% of Americans, there are 330 million Americans, let's say 340 million Americans. So that'd be 170 million Americans would have become infected, and 1% of those would have died. That's 1.7 million Americans would have died if we just did nothing and just let it sweep through, just because of what the virus is. I mean, it's just the virus kills us and it spreads, and it would have just done its thing. So that would have been awful. Now, we're still going to have, as I predicted in Apollo 0, between 500,000 and 1 million deaths, and now we're blown by 500,000. We'll probably surpass 750,000 deaths. And I just need listeners to understand that this is a calamity. I mean, losing 750,000 or 1 million people, that's the leading killer in our society. It's a huge number of dead people. And the virus would have devastated our economy even if the government had done nothing, our economy would have collapsed. That's what happens in economies when there's a virus. I mean, during the plague of Justinian 1,500 years ago, John of Ephesus, a historian and a priest, is describing what's happening in his society. And he says everything stopped and ceased. All was turned to naught. Those shops all closed. There was no government ordering stores to close 1,500 years ago. They closed because the people stopped going to shops, and shopkeepers were afraid. And so the virus collapses our economy. And Larry Summers, a former Treasury Secretary, and David Cutler, a health economist at Harvard, published an article a few months ago that called this the $16 trillion virus. $8 trillion in damage, economic damage to our GDP, and $8 trillion because of death, disability, and illness. That's equivalent, from the moment this virus reached our shores, that's equivalent to going to every family of 4 and taking away $200,000 from them. Yeah. You were made $200,000 poorer the moment the virus hit our shores. My point is, this is a bad virus. It's a devastating thing that's happened to our society. Hundreds of thousands of people are going to die and have died. Trillions of dollars of wealth will be destroyed. So we absolutely needed to take it seriously. And now I've lost the plot because I've been meandering so much. What was your question? It was about what?
Yeah, just about how my initial question was how you viewed this as a sociologist. But no, I think you answered it, and I think that what the audience needs to understand is, like, my wife's salon has been shut down because she does like eyebrows and stuff. Yes. And but it would have, I mean, if one of her technicians would have gotten COVID and then spread it, like, it would have gotten shut down anyway. And that's something that that a lot of people don't talk about when it comes to economic.
Or her customers would have, for example, during the anxiety caused by the plague, said, I'm going to reduce my spending, and so I consider this a luxury purchase and I'm not going to buy it. Or her customers would have said, people are sick, I'm not going to go out. I'm going to stay at home. I mean, and it wouldn't have taken a lot of business loss for your wife's salon to have to close anyway. Maybe a 50%. It's not like every single customer would have to stop. She has certain fixed costs in running her business. And so that, only a certain reduction in clientele would have been enough to ruin it. My point is this is typical. Like, even if the governor, which I imagine is what happened in California, closed the salons, even if he hadn't, your wife might still have had difficulty with her salon. That's what happens during times of plague.
I do work with Heterodox Academy, which I believe that you've worked with in the past and things like that. I don't want to dwell on the events of like 2015, like the stuff that happened, but the culture wars that have grown out of like events that are still pretty recent. It concerns a lot of college professors. I just had Eric Smith on my podcast, was my last guest, a rhetoric and composition professor, and his area has been really overrun by a lot of unacademic, unintellectual kind of ideas. You've kind of stayed silent on that, like to some degree, from what I've seen. Is it just you want to just stay like, hey, I'm doing my work, just keep nonsense from wherever it's coming out of my lab. I have important work to do, or
Yes,
is that
yes, that's my philosophy.
Okay.
I mean, I've been very concerned with with civil society as a citizen my whole career,
Mhm.
and civil rights. I've been very concerned. I do not want the police to treat people unequally based on extraneous factors like the color of their skin. That's unjust and wrong. That's not the kind of society I want to live in. I've been very worried about press freedom around the world, including in our society, and freedom of expression in our society. So when I was at Harvard, before I moved to Yale in 2013, I came to the defense of some students who were using satire to criticize some elite final clubs, and these were minority students. I have come to the defense of doctors and nurses during the time of COVID, where they were reporting what was happening and their employers tried to punish them, which is ridiculous. Like, what kind of civilized society tries to stop people from speaking? That is not the kind of society I don't think we want to live in. And in fact, the pandemic began in part because China, the Chinese Communist Party, tried to stop some of the doctors in Wuhan from sounding the alarm.
Yeah.
There was supposed to be a Chinese Communist Party convention, I think January the 11th or 12th of 2020, as the epidemic was gathering steam. And the local authorities there didn't want the emerging epidemic to, upset the apple cart of the planned party convention. And so they quashed the communication and the free expression of scientists and physicians working in that, and that was harmful. And we in the United States repeated that mistake in many ways. And I've also spoken out against the constraints on free expression on college campuses, which I think are ridiculous. I think it's not just that we ought not punish people for expressing themselves. It's that we ought to affirmatively encourage free expression and tolerate things that we don't want to hear. If you tell me you're in favor of free expression, I would ask you to say, who is a person whose ideas you disagree with that you would either defend or that you would invite to speak on your campus? If you can't name such a person that you disagree with, that you want to come and speak on your campus, then you're not actually in favor of free expression. You're just in favor of the expression of people you agree with. So, and I think in our college campuses should absolutely be the place where no ideas are prohibited, where any idea can be discussed. Now, that doesn't mean if you hear an idea you disagree with, you can't denounce it.
Of course, yeah.
Of course you can.
That's part of it. That's part of the
Yes,
dance.
that's the contention. That's right. And I would say, if you are so convinced of the rectitude of your ideas, win the battle of ideas. Win the argument. Don't silence the opponent. The answer to speech you do not like is more speech. And this way in which we seek to fire people for their expression, which is on the right and on the left, it occurs, by the way. It's not just the left that is trying to fire people. The right is also trying to fire people. It's immature. It's just immature for a great nation like ours. We should be able to hear what someone says and say, I completely disagree with what you're saying, and here's why. Yeah.
And at institutions that are, the place where,
Yes.
our elite university system,
Yes, and you should teach your students, if you don't, you should have them read Tinker v. Des Moines.
Yeah.
Right? That the free speech does not stop at the schoolhouse gate. It's one of the canonical Supreme Court findings, and high school students could benefit from reading from that. And then you should say to them, what would be the new thing? There's bong hits for Jesus, that other famous case where these high school students were wearing this t-shirt that said bong hits for Jesus, and the principal saw the student off campus wearing this t-shirt and then sought to sanction the student. But the students will be on the side of the kid wearing bong hits for Jesus. So what you need to do is you need to ask the students, what's something you disagree with?
Yeah.
That you would defend that kid from wearing that t-shirt. And that's a hard lesson for young people to learn.
Well, yeah, I mean, this has been my focus now for a couple of years because I'm seeing it in K through 12 and I'm seeing it everywhere. And the whole kind of reason I started this podcast is I reached out to a lot of well-known college professors who disagree with your statements that you just made. And I said, please, what am I missing here? I am genuinely curious. What am I missing here? I don't want to make assumptions about your beliefs, but if you won't talk or defend your beliefs, then I have to make assumptions. Where there's ambiguity, where ambiguity exists, then assumptions are going to be made. And I think that that's a real problem. And I don't know how many people that are getting a lot of clout right now agree with the statements you just made, and that's disturbing me. Just to wrap it up, because I know you have a hard stop, but I really appreciate this conversation. Can I just ask you, just like with a quick response, what was your high school experience like? Because if I could help facilitate more people into thinking the way that you are, the way that you're taking, I mean, you have a high horsepower brain, Nicholas, but you're using it. I have a lot of students with high horsepower brains. They go into the financial sector and they want to become hedge fund managers. You didn't. You could have. Can you just give me like a 1 minute response? So how do I get more people to?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I would say there's nothing wrong with wanting to make money.
No.
And there's nothing wrong necessarily with being a hedge fund manager. And I think, but I think that we would want a society where there's enough opportunities for people to do all kinds of different things, including become scientists. And surely we need kids to do all kinds of things, to become scientists and engineers and doctors and writers and artists and everything, honestly. I mean, that's what a healthy, civilized society does. Provides all kinds of opportunities for people. No, I was very nerdy. My parents, I was born in the United States, but then we returned to Greece, and my parents came back to the United States when I was 6. I didn't speak any English, but I had a Greek education, and so I skipped a year as a result. I was put in first grade or something instead of kindergarten or whatever it was. I don't remember the precise timing. Anyway, the result was that I was 16 during my senior year in high school. I turned 17 just before graduating. So I was, physically immature compared to my peers, which sucks in high school, and very nerdy, which is also not so great. So my high school experience was, mezza. But I went to a wonderful private school for high school. I went to public schools until ninth grade, until 7th grade. And then I switched to this private school. And it was also a school for boys, which is another problem. So my high school experience was not necessarily typical, but I had magnificent teachers, magnificent. And I remember my high school teachers. I'm still friends with one. His name is Paul Piazza. He's an English teacher, and I still email him, 50 years later, not 50, 45 years later, 40 years later. Paul and I are in contact. In fact, Paulo Zero, he's one of the teachers that I dedicate the book to. So it's dedicated in part to him. I'm trying to see if there were other high school teachers. No, he was the only high school teacher I mentioned. So.
Well, that's inspiring for me because that's kind of what I'm aiming for. Thank you so much. Really appreciate everything you're doing. Appreciate you taking the time out to do this. And
thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you for having me, William, and good luck.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.